First hours. The world holds its breath. Imagine the exact moment. Not a gradual dimming, not a slow fade to black, but an instantaneous severing. At 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, every electrical current on Earth ceases. The hum that has defined modern civilization since Thomas Edison flipped the first switch in 1882 simply stops. In New York City alone, 344 hospitals lose power simultaneously. Ventilators serving approximately 96,000 patients across the United States fall silent within the same heartbeat. Traffic signals across Los Angeles, governing the movement of 4 million daily commuters, go dark in an instant. Elevators in the Empire State Building, the Willis Tower, and 10,000 other skyscrapers freeze between floors, trapping an estimated 200,000 people nationwide in steel boxes suspended in the sky. The first death arrives within minutes, not from violence, not from fire, but from silence. In intensive care units from Philadelphia to San Diego, patients dependent on electrical life support begin to fail as backup generators. Themselves reliant on electrically controlled fuel systems, sputter and die within 40 minutes of the event. Emergency responders, their radio systems dead, their GPS units dark, their vehicles increasingly reliant on electronic ignition systems, face a cascade of failures they have no language to describe. Dispatchers stare at blank screens. Ambulances sit inert in garages. Approximately 43% of all vehicles manufactured after 2010 require functional electronics to operate at all. The darkness means something different depending on where you stand. In Manhattan, where 30,000 people occupy every square mile, the shutdown of subway systems traps approximately 5 million passengers underground or mid-tunnel. The pumps that keep the tunnels beneath the Hudson River from flooding are electric. Engineers estimate those tunnels begin taking on water within 72 hours. Meanwhile, in the Mojave Desert, water stops flowing through aqueducts serving Phoenix and Las Vegas the moment electrically driven pumping stations lose their power. Phoenix, a city of 5 million people in an environment that receives just 8 inches of rain annually, has approximately 48 hours of emergency water reserves. The cold math emerges quickly. The United States, with its 330 million people, operates on a grid that delivers 4 trillion kilowatt hours of electricity annually. Every piece of that system is now gone. The infrastructure did not merely shut down, it effectively ceased to exist. And the world that runs on it begins, within the first hours, its long and irreversible unraveling. First weeks, the hunger arrives. By the time the first full week has passed, the shape of catastrophe becomes measurable. Approximately 230 million Americans live in urban or suburban environments, entirely dependent on electrically managed food supply chains. The average American supermarket carries enough inventory to feed its surrounding community for roughly 3 days. By day 4, those shelves are bare. By day 7, a population larger than Brazil is without reliable food access. The refrigerated trucks that normally move 40 billion pounds of perishable goods across American highways each year have stopped. The cold storage facilities in Chicago's meatpacking district, which once held enough beef to feed the entire Midwest for a month, are rotting in the summer heat, generating methane clouds detectable from miles away. Water becomes the second crisis. Cities like San Antonio and Dallas rely on electrically pumped municipal water systems for every drop that reaches a faucet. Hospitals cannot sterilize equipment. Sewage treatment plants, without electricity to run their aeration systems and pumps, begin backing up within days. By week 2, raw sewage is surfacing in the streets of Philadelphia, Houston, and Los Angeles. The diseases that 19th century sanitation engineering eliminated, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, begin their quiet return to American soil for the first time in over a century. Public health officials. If anyone is still coordinating public health, would calculate that contaminated water sources will kill more Americans in the first year than any other single cause. The fires come next. Gas lines, normally regulated by electronically controlled pressure systems, begin leaking without their monitoring infrastructure. In San Francisco, where much of the housing stock predates modern fire codes, 18 separate fires ignite within the first 10 days, with no functioning fire department able to respond and no hydrant pressure to deliver water. The city that survived the great earthquake of 1906 watches neighborhoods burn in patterns eerily similar to that disaster, but this time, no reconstruction crews will arrive. Estimates suggest that between 15 and 25% of all urban wooden structures in America will burn within the first 2 years of the event. In rural areas, a different reality is taking shape. Farmers with mechanical equipment, hand tools, and access to seeds find themselves suddenly, unexpectedly, essential. A third-generation wheat farmer in Kansas with a diesel tractor and a mechanical fuel pump becomes, within a month, among the most powerful people within 50 miles. The distance from New York to Chicago, once a 45-minute flight, becomes an impassable social gulf. The nation is already fracturing into communities of survival. First year, the new geography of survival. 1 year in, the United States that once existed has been replaced by something geographers would struggle to name. The great urban concentrations that defined American life. The 12 million people of Greater Los Angeles. The 20 million of the New York metropolitan area have undergone the most violent demographic transformation in human history. Approximately 65% of major urban populations have dispersed, died, or relocated to more survivable environments. The process was not orderly. It was not managed. It looked, to those who lived through it, like the end of everything they had ever known. New York City's water system, an engineering marvel that normally delivers 1,300,000,000 gallons daily to 8 million people, stopped functioning within weeks. The Catskill Aqueduct, which stretches 122 miles from reservoir to city, requires constant electrical monitoring and pump management to maintain pressure and flow. Without it, the city that never sleeps became the city that could not drink. The Statue of Liberty, standing sentinel in the harbor, watches as an estimated 4 to 6 million people attempt to leave the 5 boroughs on foot, by bicycle, by horse-drawn cart, by any means available, heading north, west, and south, into a countryside entirely unprepared to receive them. The survivors are clustering along river valleys, near agricultural land, and around small towns whose infrastructure was never entirely dependent on electricity in the first place. Communities of 10,000 to 50,000 people, small enough to manage on foot, large enough to support basic division of labor, emerge as the most viable social units. Towns in Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas find themselves absorbing refugees from coastal megacities. The dynamics are not always peaceful. Population pressure against finite food resources produces conflict as reliably as it always has in human history. What is being rediscovered 12 months into the silence is older knowledge. Blacksmiths, whose craft was considered obsolete, are now essential. Seed saving, which industrial agriculture had rendered unnecessary, is suddenly the difference between a community's survival and its extinction. The Hoover Dam stands intact across the Colorado River, a monument to a civilization that knew how to build in stone and steel. But its turbines are still, and the 440 miles of aqueduct it once fed carry no water south toward an Arizona that desperately needs it. The land has not changed. The people moving across it are learning painfully who they have always been underneath the electricity. Years 1 to 10. The Great Reduction. The decade following the event is characterized by demographers, in whatever academic tradition survived to study it, as the Great Reduction. The United States, which entered the silence with 330 million people, exits the first decade with a population that historians would conservatively estimate at between 80 and 110 million. The math is brutal in its simplicity. Modern American life expectancy of approximately 79 years was built entirely on a medical system that requires electricity. Refrigerated vaccines, electrically powered surgical theaters, dialysis machines, insulin that requires refrigeration, pacemakers that require batteries, MRI machines that require more power than a small town once consumed. Without these, life expectancy collapses toward pre-industrial norms of approximately 40 to 45 years. The children born in year 3 and year 4 of the silence are the first generation that will never know electricity as a lived reality. They grow up in communities that have rediscovered the logic of pre-electrical civilization with extraordinary speed, because they have no alternative. By year 7, most surviving communities have re-established rudimentary grain milling using water wheels, the same technology that served the American colonies in 1750. Blacksmithing operations, producing nails, hinges, axe heads, and plow blades have become the industrial backbone of small-town economies from the Appalachians to the Rockies. The great cities are not empty. They are inhabited, but by shadows of themselves. Chicago, once supporting 2.5 million people within city limits, supports perhaps 40,000 by year 8. A number determined entirely by access to the Chicago River and the agricultural capacity of the surrounding flat prairie. These residents occupy the lower floors of massive structures they neither built nor fully understand, burning furniture and eventually structural timber for warmth through Illinois winters that regularly drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The Willis Tower, 110 stories of steel and glass, loses its glass cladding in a series of catastrophic winter events as interior heating disappears. The freeze-thaw cycle beginning a demolition process that no human hand will ever reverse. Nature, which has been waiting with the patience of deep time, begins to move. In Los Angeles, the Santa Monica Mountains push chaparral into neighborhoods within 3 years. Eastern coyotes colonize Brooklyn by year 4. White-tailed deer graze on Central Park's former lawns, and in the distance, visible on clear days from San Francisco's surviving hilltop communities, the Golden Gate Bridge stands unchanged. A reminder that steel endures even when the civilization that forged it does not. Years 10 to 50, the forests return. By the 40-year mark, any observer arriving from the past would fail to recognize the continent they once knew. The transformation has not been gradual in any comfortable sense. It has been aggressive, compound, and accelerating. The process ecologists call succession, the sequential replacement of plant communities as an ecosystem recovers from disturbance, has been running at maximum speed across 48 states. In the American Northeast, where temperate broadleaf forest is the climax ecosystem, trees have reclaimed suburban landscapes with a speed that surprises even the most optimistic ecological models. Formerly paved surfaces crack first along their edges, then through their centers, as freeze-thaw cycles and root pressure do the work of 1,000 jackhammers operating without rest. Philadelphia's row houses, built largely of brick with wooden interiors, begin their structural collapse between years 15 and 25. The wooden floor joists rot first, compromised by moisture that building systems once controlled. When the floors fail, the roof structures follow. Block by block, the city disassembles itself, and what emerges from the rubble within a decade of each collapse is a woodland understory. Bird populations in these reclaimed urban areas reach densities not recorded in the region since before European settlement. Baltimore orioles nest in what were once parking structures. Peregrine falcons, which adapted brilliantly to urban cliff face analogs, remain, hunting through canyons of crumbling concrete. In the American Southeast, the process is faster and wilder. Houston, built on Gulf Coast prairie with summer temperatures reaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit and annual rainfall of approximately 50 inches, becomes jungle with extraordinary speed. Within 15 years, stands of loblolly pine 20 feet tall occupy former parking lots. Water moccasins colonize flooded highway underpasses. Alligators, whose range has been expanding northward for decades, establish populations in what were once suburban retention ponds. The Bayou City returns, literally, to Bayou. The human communities that survive this period share certain characteristics. They are located near reliable fresh water. They have access to agricultural land with sufficient topsoil. They have maintained enough metallurgical knowledge to produce and repair iron tools. And crucially, they have maintained written records, kept in waterproof containers, protected by community consensus. Because in a world without electricity, paper is once again the most durable information storage medium available. The Library of Congress holds 17 million books. The communities that carry copies of even a few hundred of them hold an enormous survival advantage. Years 50 to 100. The century of reclamation. At the century mark, a traveler crossing North America on horseback. The primary long-distance travel method of the surviving population would encounter a landscape in which human settlement patterns have reverted almost entirely to pre-industrial logic. Settlements cluster at river confluences, at natural harbor sites, at the edges of the most productive agricultural soils. The Mississippi River corridor, which supported civilization for thousands of years before electricity existed, has re-emerged as the continent's central artery. Small cities of 10 to 50,000 people have grown at Memphis, Natchez, and Baton Rouge. Their economies built on river trade in grain, timber, preserved food, and ironwork. The river does not care about electricity. It flows, as it always has, 330 miles from the confluence of the Ohio to the Gulf of Mexico, and it carries commerce at a pace that would have been familiar to any merchant of 1800. The great landmarks of the old civilization now serve primarily as sources of salvageable material. The steel skeleton of the Empire State Building, weakened by a century of weather exposure without maintenance, has lost its stone and terracotta cladding to natural weathering. But iron and steel remain enormously valuable to a civilization rebuilding its metallurgical capacity and salvage operations conducted by workers with ropes, pulleys, and considerable courage. Strip lower floors of structural steel that is then reforged into tools, weapons, and agricultural implements. In this sense, the great cities are not ruins, but mines. They are geological deposits of refined metal that required an entire civilization to accumulate, and will serve as raw material for the civilization growing in their shadow. The human population of North America at the century mark is estimated at between 50 and 70 million. distributed in a pattern that would have been recognizable to a colonial-era cartographer. The highest densities are in the Ohio River Valley, the upper Mississippi watershed, the coastal southeast, and the Pacific Northwest valleys, where rainfall and soil combine to produce reliable agriculture. The Mojave Desert, which once sustained Phoenix and Las Vegas through the miracle of electrically driven water engineering, has returned to sparse inhabitation, populated by communities numbering in the hundreds, who have rediscovered the water harvesting techniques of the Hohokam people, who lived there 1,000 years before the first light bulb. The Golden Gate Bridge, exposed to the salt air of San Francisco Bay without maintenance coating, has developed deep surface rust, but remains structurally sound at year 100. Its steel, 0.8 of an inch thick in its main cables, will last considerably longer than the civilization that crossed it. Years 100 to 500. The long forgetting. By the 500-year mark, what archaeologists of that era call the Electrical Age has become myth more than memory. The grandchildren of grandchildren of grandchildren of the last people who operated a smartphone have only the haziest oral traditions describing the civilization that preceded theirs. Stories circulate among the river communities of the Mississippi Valley about a time when people flew through the air in metal birds, when light appeared at the touch of a finger, when voices traveled invisibly across distances of 1,000 miles. These stories are not believed in their literal form any more than medieval Europeans believed the full details of Roman engineering. They are understood as the exaggerations of an older, grander, perhaps imaginary time. What remains physically of American civilization at 500 years is selective and instructive. Concrete structures, when reinforced with steel, have mostly failed as the rebar expands through oxidation and cracks the surrounding concrete from within. This process, called rebar cancer, destroys most reinforced structures within 200 to 300 years without maintenance. However, the Hoover Dam, 726 feet of mass concrete with relatively low steel content in its main body, remains largely intact at 500 years, an incomprehensible monument to the 500 workers who died building it and the civilization that deemed it necessary. Local communities have developed religious and cultural traditions around the dam, climbing it on seasonal festivals, carving their own markings alongside the old inscriptions, incorporating it into cosmologies that explain their world. Stone structures fare best over centuries. The granite foundations of federal buildings in Washington, now a forest clearing along the Potomac, remain visible beneath vegetation. Mount Rushmore, carved 60 feet into the granite face of the Black Hills, retains the faces of 4 presidents, recognizable enough that the communities of the Northern Plains have incorporated them into their own mythologies of ancestral giants. Stone does not rot. Stone does not rust. And granite, the hardest of common building materials, will hold a carved face for 10,000 years. Ironworking has been rediscovered, lost, and rediscovered again several times in 500 years. The communities that maintain unbroken metallurgical traditions hold enormous advantages over those that lost the knowledge and had to rebuild it. The cycle of knowledge loss and recovery that characterized so much of human history before the Electrical Age has resumed its ancient rhythm. Libraries survive where communities protect them with religious devotion. Years 500 to 1,000. The new civilizations. At the 1,000-year mark, a geographer surveying North America would recognize a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history on every inhabited continent. Where reliable agricultural surplus is possible, genuine urban civilization has reemerged. Along the Mississippi Valley, a city of perhaps 100,000 people has grown at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, occupying the same site where St. Louis once stood, served by the same navigable waterways that made St. Louis a great city in the 19th century. Its streets are not gridded like the old American cities, but follow the organic logic of medieval European towns, curving along the river's edge, clustering around the smithies and grain mills and boat-building yards that constitute its industrial base. These new civilizations are not primitive. 1,000 years is an enormous span of cultural time. The people of the Mississippi Confluent City in year 1000 have sophisticated legal traditions, complex religious practices, advanced agricultural techniques including crop rotation, composting, and seed selection that would have been recognizable to an agricultural scientist of the 20th century. They have mathematics, including algebra, geometry, and the principles of accounting. They have medicine, not the medicine of hospitals and antibiotics, but the accumulated herbal and surgical knowledge of 1,000 years of necessity. Their life expectancy, approximately 55 years, exceeds the pre-antibiotic American average of 1900. The physical remnants of the electrical age continue to shape the landscape in ways that are not always recognized as artificial. The Great Highway System, 1,200 miles of Interstate 90 stretching from Boston to Seattle, has largely vanished beneath vegetation and erosion. But its elevated sections and bridge foundations create artificial ridgelines and river crossings that communities navigate along without understanding their origin. The straight-line geometry of old agricultural fields, still faintly visible in the underlying soil chemistry, guides the fields of the new farmers, who find that certain soils and certain rectangular arrangements drain better, not knowing they are farming the ghost of a section-line grid laid out by surveyors 2 centuries before electricity existed. The Brooklyn Bridge, its stone towers standing on solid Manhattan schist bedrock, remains structurally sound at 1,000 years, though its steel cables have long since failed, dropping the roadway into the East River. The towers alone remain, 2 Gothic arches rising from the water, incorporated into the mythology of the river communities of the Northeast as the gates of the Old World. Years 1,000 to 10,000. The deep return. On the scale of 10,000 years, the electrical age becomes a geological event as much as a historical one. The carbon dioxide released by the burning of fossil fuels across the industrial centuries has altered the composition of the atmosphere in ways that will remain detectable in ice cores and sedimentary records for hundreds of thousands of years. But the specific consequences of electrical civilization's end have themselves largely resolved within this time frame. Forests have reached climax equilibrium across the former continental United States. The eastern temperate forest, which once stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi before European settlement, has re-established itself in forms that would have been broadly familiar to the Lenape and Haudenosaunee peoples who managed it before the 17th century. Though with species compositions altered by the extinctions of the industrial era. The cities are gone in any meaningful sense at 10,000 years. What remains is stratigraphic. A geologist cutting into the soil of former Manhattan would find, at a depth of roughly 12 to 18 feet, a distinct layer of compressed concrete fragments, glass particles, plastic residue, and processed metal that geologists of this era call the urban stratum. This layer, found beneath the soils of every former major city on Earth, is the physical signature of the electrical age. As legible to future geologists as the iridium layer that marks the dinosaur-killing asteroid impact 66 million years ago. Humanity left its mark not in its monuments, but in its chemistry. Human civilization at the 10,000-year mark has, in certain regions, re-reached and potentially surpassed the technological level of ancient Rome. Ironworking has evolved to steelworking in at least several centers of metallurgical tradition along major river systems. Mathematics has been reinvented in forms that parallel the historical development of Greek and Islamic mathematics. Navigation techniques allow ocean crossing. The Americas, with their extraordinary agricultural potential and their rich deposits of accessible metal ores, are once again supporting civilizations of genuine complexity. The Mississippi River has shifted its course by approximately 15 miles in places over 10,000 years, as rivers do, following the natural process of meandering that human engineering had suppressed for centuries. The Hoover Dam, by this point, has been overcome by the Colorado River through a combination of sedimentation and eventual overtopping. The river has found its old channel. The canyons of the American Southwest look once again as they looked before the first dam was ever poured. Final reflection. What the darkness teaches. What does the thought experiment ultimately reveal? Not, as it might first appear, a simple lesson about dependency or fragility. The story of Earth without electricity is not a morality tale about hubris or a warning about technological overreach. It is something far more interesting. It is the story of what humanity actually is beneath the extraordinary but thin overlay of electrical civilization. And what humanity is, it turns out, is remarkably persistent. The 10,000 years that follow the silence are not a tragedy in geological time. They are a reset, painful almost beyond imagination in human terms, catastrophic in their immediate mortality, devastating in their erasure of accumulated knowledge and comfort. The loss of every person on a ventilator in the first hour, the loss of 60 to 70% of urban populations in the first decade. These are not abstractions. They represent individual lives of extraordinary value, cut short by a single infrastructural failure. The human cost of the scenario is not bearable to contemplate directly. It must be held at the distance of numbers and timescales to be processed at all. But what the darkness also reveals is the depth of human adaptability. Within one generation, communities without any electrical infrastructure are producing grain, working iron, delivering babies, educating children, creating music, telling stories, and building institutions. Within 10 generations, genuine urban civilizations are re-emerging along the continent's great river systems because those rivers were always there, and humans were always suited to live along them. The continent's agricultural potential, its mineral wealth, its freshwater resources, none of these depended on electricity. They were here before the first power plant, and they remain after the last one falls dark. The Statue of Liberty stands in New York Harbor for approximately 300 years before structural corrosion at her iron armature causes the copper skin to begin detaching, section by section, falling into the harbor below. By 500 years, only the stone pedestal remains above water, a platform from which local communities fish and launch their boats without knowing or needing to know what once stood there. The harbor remains. The fishing remains. The human need to gather at the water's edge, to feed one another, to tell stories about what came before, that remains above all. In the end, electricity was not civilization. It was civilization's most remarkable tool. And what the darkness of its absence illuminates, with a clarity that no light bulb ever could, is that the human impulse to build, to connect, to endure, requires no power source beyond itself.